So here we go. Tonight, we at Chaucer are so excited to welcome author for the evening, USC professor George Sanchez. He's going to be talking about his book on the iconic Los Angeles neighborhood, Boyle Heights. Through his book, Boyle Heights, how a Los Angeles neighborhood became the future of American democracy. George J. Sanchez is the author of the award-winning book, Becoming Mexican American. He's a professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California, fight on. Before that, he taught at UCLA, go Bruins. And before that, during that time also, he taught at the University of Michigan, so go Blue. He is the 2020-2021 president of the Organization for American Historians. In addition, he and Josefina Lopez founded the Boyle Heights Museum, which we'll talk about tonight. So please welcome Professor George Sanchez. Hello, George.
Hi, how are you doing?
Well, thank you for coming. There's so many stories in your incredible book, but the first story I'd like you to talk about is your own, because you were actually born in Boyle Heights. So if you could talk a little bit about your experience and what you remember coming back to it later on too.
Sure. Well, I was born in White Memorial Hospital in Boyle Heights. My parents are both immigrants from Mexico, and they came to Boyle Heights in '57, and were renting a home on City View, which was just north of what was then Brooklyn Avenue, now Avenida Cesar Chavez. And that's the house I came back to. I lived there for the first 5 years of my life. At that point in 1959, Boyle Heights was just becoming a predominantly Mexican-American community. It was in the 1960 census would be the first time it hit 50% Mexican-American, which is hard to believe for a lot of people because now it's 96% Latino. I lived there, but about 5 years after my father got a job in Gardena and we moved to South LA. And I would come back to Boyle Heights regularly to see family and to visit. But it always was home for me. It was always a place that I felt very comfortable with and got to know its history over time. So, and then when I returned from Michigan to teach at USC, I got involved with lots of Boyle Heights projects and decided I really wanted to write a book about the neighborhood. So, been connected ever since.
So before we begin, if you could talk, where is Boyle Heights? If you could share with people, because some people may not be familiar with
absolutely.
The location.
So if you're in downtown Los Angeles and you head east, you will eventually go over bridges. And those bridges will take you across the Los Angeles River, which is a concrete river, and into Boyle Heights. You'll first hit the area of the flats, and then you'll basically go up, and that is in fact the Heights. So Boyle Heights stretches all the way to the city limits of Los Angeles. So it's all within the city of Los Angeles, and that city limits is Indiana Street. By the way, that's been the city limit of Los Angeles from the beginning, from when it was a Mexican pueblo. So that's the easiest way to think about it. In the other direction, to the north, you'll have Lincoln Heights and what is now most people will see as the 10 freeway kind of cutting through there. To the south, the city of Vernon, which is mostly an industrial city. These days, people whiz through Boyle Heights mostly on the freeways, the 5 freeway, the 101, the 10, or the Big East LA interchange, which takes up about 15% of all the land in Boyle Heights. So it is in the city of Los Angeles, but it's the further east you can go. So it's also considered part of East Los Angeles, with the unincorporated East Los Angeles to the east of it in Belvedere, to the North City Terrace. But it has been a fundamental part of the city for a very long time.
Hmm. So it took you about 30 years to write this book, didn't it?
It did, yes.
This is obviously a labor of love. What was the pull for you to want to write such an extensive, wonderful book?
There's a couple of different pulls. Of course, I think a lot of people go back to places that they were born to tell a history. So that was certainly there. But on top of that, I my first book was a book in Mexican American history that looked at Mexican immigrants coming up to Los Angeles. And so I covered the early part
Mm,
of the 20th century. And because my focus was Mexican immigrants, when they encountered something in Boyle Heights, I would often say, "Oh, that's interesting. They were living next to Japanese Americans, or they had a connection with
mhm,
Jewish Americans, or they had this." And I kind of set those things aside. And I did it so often when
mhm,
it came to Boyle Heights, I said, "This is interesting to me." I thought, that Mexicans sort of dominated the east side of Los Angeles, even in this early period, and I just found that wasn't true. And I kept thinking some of it's in my first book, but it really wasn't sufficient. So anyway, I finished the first book thinking, "No, maybe want to return to this." Then my first book was published in 1992.
mhm,
As I started to talk about it, of course, the thing that dominated all conversations in 92 and 93 was the Los Angeles riots. And so everyone would ask me, well, can we really get along? Can we live in communities that are multiracial?
mhm,
And I said, oh my God, here's Boyle Heights kind of staring me in the face. I need to go back and really research this because people were asking questions about multiracial communities. Can they really exist?
mhm.
Can people get along without being at each other's throats all the time? The wake of the LA riots, I think, was a big impetus for me to pursue this work. But as soon as I started, I knew that I needed to know a lot more history of Jewish Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans,
Mhm.
most of which was not written about for Boyle Heights. And so that's, I set off on a fairly long passageway to do that kind of work, working with the Japanese American National Museum, the Jewish Historical Society of Southern California, doing a lot of building of interviews that would give me a richer history of Boyle Heights. And I did that for a lot of years. And then there's, of course, students, and I was a dean for a long time where you don't get much accomplished. But it was nice to have the time to really develop the book. And I think it paid off for me because I got to know the history of those other communities. And then I got to write basically the last couple of chapters on more contemporary periods that I'd not written before. So I really enjoyed the journey.
We'll get to the subject of the book in a second, but I wanted to ask, was it a big challenge for you? There wasn't a lot of written material, and to be able to get to these interviews, how big of a challenge was it for you to pull all this together? Because you're talking about stories of 4 or 5 different groups of people in living in one neighborhood.
Yeah. I had to discover the stories and individual families' own migration patterns. When they came, where they settled, how much they were in and out. But I think the other additional challenge was that I didn't want to write a book that just looked individually at each group separately. I really wanted
Mm,
to give a sense of what was happening in Boyle Heights and what interaction was like. So, for example, when I talk about people coming to Boyle Heights in the early part of the 20th century, I had to find ways to make sure I could put the story of, let's say, um, agricultural change in Japan that led people to both Hawaii and then eventually to Boyle Heights in conversation with the Mexican Revolution that was bringing people to the north, what was happening to urban African Americans coming from the south, what happened to Jewish migrants in Eastern Europe, and then eventually in the East Coast coming. So there were connections that I wanted to make between all these stories of transformations in industrialism, the ways in which former agricultural families became urban families in Boyle Heights. and the fact that they all ended up in a city that at that time was really known for being an open shop. It didn't have labor unions. It was very much against labor unions. And here were all these people coming from places, revolution in Mexico, a strong anarchist movement in Italy, a socialist movement in Japan, Yiddish cultural traditions of labor unions in Eastern Europe, all of those things meshing together in a place like Boyle Heights. So that to me was very important to tell those stories in concert with each other, and to find ways that every chapter isn't about a single group, but about the groups working together or what was happening to them in relationship to each other. And that was actually a challenge. That's some fairly new approaches in the writing of American history.
Well, I think it's a very new approach to telling of American history, because when you read about books of ethnic neighborhoods in New York or whatever, it always just seems to be separate, just specifically about the Italian neighborhood in New York or Chinatown in San Francisco. So what I found unique and very refreshing about your book was the fact that you intermingled everything together and was able to put it in a context of history, as well as give the reader a sense of place of the neighborhood that they're in.
Yeah, that was the exciting part of it. I came to realize that some of the stories are interrelated. That one of the big light bulbs that popped in my head was when I discovered that the same LA County officials who had organized Mexican repatriation in the early 1930s and the moving out of Mexicans were actually the same people that pushed for Japanese internment. And so they took kind of population removal as something that was now very commonplace in lots of things in Boyle Heights. And when you realize it's actually the same people in county welfare, in social services that were doing both works, you realize, oh my God, they established patterns across racial groups that are really important. And so when you take into account, let's say, urban renewal, all those things are linked in really interesting ways from one vantage point. And they were happening to communities that were literally in the same neighborhoods.
When you look at it that way, you can see how things happen later in life and how they keep repeating themselves, and as well get really frustrated by the fact they're happening over and over again.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
So the ironic thing about Boyle Heights is it was founded as an enclave for Caucasian people.
Yes. Yes. Well, almost all neighborhoods in Los Angeles, as it was developing, or Southern California as it was developing in the late 19th century, had as their goal to try to attract newcomers with wealth from the East. So Boyle Heights is very similar to other places. I like to have people identify where the Victorian homes are in Los Angeles. There's a kind of circle which includes the area around USC, up Hoover, includes areas by Dodger Stadium, and includes Boyle Avenue and Boyle Heights. There's Victorian homes that are very large, intended for white migrants from the East or the Midwest that come with money. And in the late 19th century, that was the goal of almost all developing neighborhoods. In the book, I tell the story of Pasadena that was developed by investors from Indiana who put palm trees down on Orange Grove Avenue, and by the turn of the 20th century, we're already sponsoring a parade, that would become our Rose Parade. They did it really quickly, and they did it well, and they were able, I think mostly because Pasadena was a separate city, to do it in such a way that they got those immigrants that they were searching for. Boyle Heights was a little bit clunky because it was part of the city of LA, so everything was slower. It didn't quite have the attraction yet because it didn't have all of the bridges built yet. It was a little close to the developing industry. And then all of a sudden in the 1890s, all the beach communities started to develop. So Santa Monica, Redondo Beach, and that's where a lot of the new migrants would go. Basically, LA would go to the west as opposed to those migrants coming to the east. The other big thing is that those new communities, particularly the new cities, but really throughout, put into the homes that they were building racially restrictive covenants. So these were parts of documents that basically mandated that you could not sell this home to an African American, to a Mexican American, to Asian Americans, and often to even specific white ethnic groups, Jews, Italians. That made them attractive to some of those white migrants from the Midwest and East that wanted to come and be away from those populations. They used to talk about, you know, I didn't come to LA to move to Chicago. This was the whitest city in the United States. Chicago was now teeming with immigrants. So was New York. I wanted to be in this other place. So racially restrictive covenants was one way that the newly built Southern California would attract those migrants. Boyle Heights never had those restrictive covenants in the same way. And so in the end, the people that owned the land in Boyle Heights decided, well, industry is moving here. We need a place for more working class migrants.
Mhm.
And so we're not going to put covenants in, and we'll build the lots a little smaller. We'll let them develop in a different way. And sure enough, you had working class migrants come and find that Boyle Heights was more affordable to them. And so that's where migrants from all over the world basically would then pour into Boyle Heights. Russian Moluccans from escaping the Japo-Russian War of 1903, Mexicans coming up from the revolution, Japanese coming, African Americans coming in to Union Station from the South, and Jewish migrants who were working class as opposed to the Hollywood crowd on the west side.
Mhm.
They would all find homes in Boyle Heights that they could afford and would keep them close to kind of the industrial occupations that were growing all around downtown Los Angeles.
So how did they hear about Boyle Heights when all these people are coming in at the same time?
Well, it would vary by group. For example, in the Jewish community, it was often rabbis who would establish contacts in terms of other places in the US that people could come. There was a big effort to try to move more Jews out of New York City and move them west. And so they were looking for a place in the West. Boyle Heights became very attractive for people who were trying to, at that time, it was a health issue to come to very clean, airy, tuberculosis-free Boyle Heights. That was seen as kind of this air, and people were recruited because Los Angeles had at that time clean air, if you can believe it. You know, the African Americans often were told to come to Boyle Heights when they were on the trains, because many of the African American porters who were on the trains lived in Boyle Heights. It was a place that they had settled in, and so that was one way. Japanese Americans came to Boyle Heights particularly after the San Francisco earthquake, and that community in San Francisco came down because they did not want to go through the rebuilding process. And Boyle Heights was kind of a suburban extension from Little Tokyo, which had been developed already. And so people looking for a little more land, being out of the intense Little Tokyo area, would move into Boyle Heights down First Street. Mexicans, of course, came up with through trains and so they were close in terms of the flats to where the railroad cars were. And they eventually moved from what was growing in downtown LA across the river to Boyle Heights and the rest of East Los Angeles. So you had a lot of people coming for different reasons. And some of that, like I'm always impressed by the Italians who came because they were coming from an anarchist tradition, and they wanted to fight with Flores Magón in the Mexican Revolution. So they had a different reason for coming, and a very political reason to kind of attach themselves to this community. So yeah, Boyle Heights became known as a place that was more open and where diversity was okay.
Some groups, like the Jewish groups, were actually fleeing something, and that's why they moved there.
Yes, they were fleeing, pogroms which were growing in Russia and Eastern Europe, and in the early part of the 20th century, really flipped from most of the Jewish population of the world being in Europe and Eastern Europe to very heavy population in the United States. Los Angeles was part of that, but for the Jewish community, Los Angeles was often a secondary migrant point. So they had first moved to New York or Chicago or some other place, and then after some time had decided, well, I think I'm going to continue west. So there was, for the Jewish community, more people who had first settled somewhere else, but then this was a secondary place for them to move, and became very important, particularly in building Yiddish culture in the United States. They became eventually the largest group in Boyle Heights by 1930. They were about 40% of the population. And that meant that they brought with them many of the labor unions that they had set up. And that was everything from garment workers to the Hatters Union, carpenters, were actually resided in Boyle Heights and often worked, their main work sites were right downtown across the river.
Which brings us to Rose Posada.
Yes.
She was a Jewish immigrant, wasn't she? And she was an early activist for Mexican organized labor.
Right. In the 1930s, the main, well, there were several different people working in the clothing manufacturing industry. The main dressmakers were Latina workers. There had people doing suits and other kinds of special clothing were often Jewish or Italian and were predominantly men. But by numbers, it was the women that dominated the garment industry.
Mm-hmm.
Rose Posada came from New York. She was a New York organizer, but she'd had experience in Los Angeles. And after FDR was elected president, David Dubinsky from New York decided Posada would be the right person to try to organize the mostly Mexican, some Jewish female workers in Los Angeles. And so in 1933, there was the first dressmaker strike that she organized, and she did that by, really knowing that she wanted to connect with the Mexican American women workers. She sponsored Spanish language radio programs to be broadcast. She did a bilingual newspaper, and she went house to house looking for support in Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, Belvedere. And in the end, it was the first successful strike of the New Deal era in Los Angeles. And really, she was organizing across those racial lines. She was very important. She would come back from New York several times in the 1930s to continue that work. It became one of the leading industries for union activity under the New Deal.
There's so many incredible labor stories. It just reminds me of how the Japanese and the Mexicans in Oxnard banded together to form a union.
Yes.
In the strawberry plants. In terms of the Western or the European migration in Boyle Heights, I also like to talk about the Anti-Fascism Movement in the 30s. I thought that was extremely important because California was very conservative at the time, on the verge of fascism, and a lot of these groups really pushed back against that.
Exactly. The leaders in Boyle Heights and the Jewish community were looking at what was happening in Europe. We're looking at the rise of Adolf Hitler and in Germany in the 30s, and we're quite concerned. And in fact, my colleague Steve Ross has written a wonderful book called Hitler in Los Angeles that really looks at the ways in which fascist movements really started to build in Southern California in the 1930s. And actually Nazi agents were in Los Angeles, particularly by the late 30s when the US is already gearing up to build ships to support the British and in the war effort. They're spying essentially in the docks. They're looking at this buildup. They're sending messages back, and they're very worried about the Jewish community in Los Angeles. So they have plans that were uncovered that included everything from, mass killings of Jews in Boyle Heights, and then picking off the leadership on the West Side and in Hollywood. All these amazing plans in the 1930s. All the time, the Jewish Community Relations Bureau is telling the LAPD, you have to take these people seriously. And the LAPD is not worried about fascist movements in the 1930s. They're worried about communist movements. And so they are actually attacking many of the leftist organizations in Boyle Heights, raiding them and so forth, particularly when they do rent strikes and a lot of things that were happening in the 30s because the economy had collapsed. So it wasn't really until very close to World War II that the LAPD shifted to actually thinking of fascism as a real concern for Los Angeles, and that's when they kind of began using the intelligence that the Jewish Community Relations committees were actually feeding them for at least about 10 years. And it's a pretty tragic story of the inattention of the LAPD to these threats to American democracy.
I'm sure it's behind the Otises and the Huntingtons were a little bit behind this.
There was a lot of that, but there was also, remember that there's lots of little stories that I think are really intriguing. One is that a USC track coach took runners to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And though we think about that as where Jesse Owens sort of came in, that track coach also eliminated all the Jewish runners from the track team.
Yeah.
And he was very celebrated upon his return, and he was a regular speaker at fascist gatherings in Altadena and a lot of places in suburban, and he would speak at these fascist rallies. It wasn't that bad. I was in Germany. Hitler's doing a pretty good job. There are speeches of this happening, and that's what actually the track is named after at USC right now. So I think about these as stories that we have to really incorporate and look at if that's a wise decision for the university to name a track after this particular coach.
Well, encouraged by Avery Brundage, you get athletes like Louis Zamperini, the hero of Unbroken, personally met Adolf Hitler, and they used that as a big publicity thing. The city, in terms of Boyle Heights, also were determined to do progress for the public good, quote unquote. And this included a repatriation efforts.
Right.
And if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when the Depression hit, and about 1/3 of all the population in Southern California was unemployed, there was an effort to try to find scapegoats, both locally and then federally. Herbert Hoover was president. He was losing support very quickly. And he instructed his Secretary of Labor to find jobs and figure out what was happening. And in Los Angeles, there was a committee on unemployment relief, and they began to write to Hoover and William Doak, his labor secretary, saying, hey, we could, if we moved out Mexican immigrants, we'd open up all these jobs. And so through a series of back and forths, they would end up conceiving of plans to basically deport or to send back a good part of the Mexican population of Los Angeles to Mexico. Now, that eventually would be picked up as a plan by the LA County Board of Supervisors. And what they would do is pay for trains to take people back to Mexico, hand them off to the Mexican government would take them to the interior. They didn't really care that 2/3 of the people that they ended sending back were actually US citizens. They were children born in the United States. But it was seen as a convenient way to get people moved back. And of course, it didn't end the depression. It didn't. Instead, what happened was that you had about 1/3 of all the Mexicans in Los Angeles sent back to Mexico during the 1930s. So it really hurts the community in a tremendous amount of ways. And of course, Boyle Heights is almost the first community that's targeted because it's right there next to downtown. And in the book, I talk about very specific blocks and places in which you had just, multiple people from the same neighborhood that eventually set back. Some of them who had lived in Los Angeles for 20 or 30 years and simply, they were out of work. And rather than help them with a little food, other kinds of things that they needed, they had one option. They were given a train ticket and they said, "You've got to go back." And initially, many of them did. Over a while, it became more of a pushing contest to try to get them back. And once FDR was elected and became president, more of them attached themselves to the vision of the New Deal and to staying in Los Angeles. So it became harder and harder for that to occur. But that set a pattern that you would see replicated in Boyle Heights.
Mm. And the Japanese Americans moved in, and there are all these different ethnic groups. And not only that, there were differences in religion. How were they able to get along with each other and be able to coexist with each other?
They, one of the most interesting things about Boyle Heights, it still is a place that has all kinds of houses of worship, from synagogues to Catholic churches to Buddhist temples, Protestant denominations. And of course, in the Japanese American community, you had both Protestant denominations because of the missionary movements in Japan, but then you also had Buddhist temples and other kinds of temples. The one, my favorite, is the Tenriko shrine along First Street, that made homes. And they were, they're often still there in Boyle Heights. You can go see them. For the Japanese American community today, they still come back there to Boyle Heights to celebrate religious activity every weekend and so forth. One of the things that I think is really striking about the Tenriko Church, it's a beautiful church, emphasizes music, had wonderful, still has wonderful instruments, traditional instruments all through it. When the Japanese Americans were put in internment camps, they lived very close to the one significant African American community in Boyle Heights near Evergreen Cemetery. And a Protestant denomination from that African American community basically took care of the Tenriko Church and its instruments, used it for its services, but as soon as people came back from internment, handed it back to those church leaders in perfect condition. So there was a lot of cooperation across those lines, particularly when people saw that somebody else from the neighborhood, from the community, was being oppressed in some way. Other people stepped up to try to protect the property, to try to take care of things for that community while they were gone.
It seemed like they had a more of an empathetic response.
Yes, well, you lived with people. They were your neighbors. If you were in school, they were your classmates. Roosevelt High School, the class of 1942, was 1/3 Japanese American. Japanese Americans were the student body president, the editor of the school newspaper. So when FDR said that these people were going to internment camps, the school lost 1/3 of its student body. And people didn't understand it. These are the folks that they had grown up with in the neighborhood. And so there was empathy because there was real experience across those racial lines. Classmates, neighbors, people saw them as part of the community.
I'm glad you mentioned the internment experience because obviously I told you before, it's personal to me. My father was interned His father was arrested by the FBI, separated from the family for 2 years. Eventually, it killed my grandmother while she was in camp, this arrest. So it's a very touchy subject with me. But what I loved about this was, as you said, that the people's response to the Japanese Americans, as far as the Jewish response, the Mexican American response, was a very compassionate thing, which is contrary to what the leaders did. And you had mentioned some of the Los Angeles city leaders, but not so much the obvious ones, but the ones who had sympathies toward Japanese Americans prior to the war, yet they spoke for internment. I'm talking about LA Supervisor John Anson Ford and Mayor Fletcher Bowen. And they were kind of caught in between, but they acted differently from what I would expect how they would act.
Yeah, I mean, these were particularly John Anson Ford. He was the supervisor with the most Japanese Americans in his district. He represented Little Tokyo. He represented BOYLE Heights. And I think initially both of them, right after Pearl Harbor, were both, you thought they were going to be sympathetic. You thought they were going to, but eventually they become very anti-Japanese American. And John Anson Ford is kind of the fifth vote from the supervisors to make it unanimous to support internment. I think from the very start, Ford feels a certain kind of guilt. And he's interacting with his own friends and people who supported him politically, who are now in the camps. And I use a number of letters that were written between him and Kei Sugahara, who was the head of the Japanese American Citizens League, to talk about how uncomfortable this was. He's trying to say, you've done this very patriotic thing to go to the camps, and Sugahara's writing back, this is going to be a mistake for Los Angeles for a long time to come. You're going to have to deal with people, and he's talking about, he says specifically, the African American and the Jew who feel like you've stepped over a line here, and there's going to be more intense tension during World War II. So I'm very interested in how that shifts and changes, and how different it is, as you mentioned, from the population in BOYLE Heights, which is trying to understand, in a wartime, what exactly is going on here, and why, if they can take away my neighbor, one person says, what happens if we go to war with Mexico? I'm going to be taken,
Yeah.
seeing this right in front of them. And so there's a lot of fear that these kinds of activities will bounce back against other ethnic groups over time. In fact, during World War II, most of the Latino academics feel like the Zoot Suit riots happened right after the Japanese Americans were interned, because the city needed another scapegoat. They needed to find someone else that they were now going to go after. And so these Mexican American young people wearing Zoot Suits became a target.
It's ironic, we were in the middle of a war, yet Americans were beating on other Americans.
That's right. That's right.
But the response of, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
But the response of the BOYLE Heights residents caused the Japanese, after their return back to their homes, a lot of them didn't move back to LA, but a lot of them moved back to BOYLE Heights.
Yeah, there was a lot of tension, a lot of parts of Los Angeles that did not want Japanese Americans to come back. But the people in BOYLE Heights sort of welcomed people back and tried to make them feel more at home. And it was a huge effort for city leaders to find places. So there was a lot of, the initial return often was to BOYLE Heights. In the end, BOYLE Heights had a larger Japanese American population immediately after the war than it had before, because so many people found that BOYLE Heights is one of the few places that welcome folks back.
The one group after the war that shrank was the Jewish population. And I was wondering if you can expand a little bit about that. I'm going to put up this little map here.
Sure.
And what happened with the Jewish population in Boyle Heights?
So one of the things that occurred is that first, during the war itself, of course, Jewish young people signed up to fight in the war in very high numbers. In fact, one of the first planes that was sponsored by a local neighborhood was called the Spirit of Boyle Heights. You got to name the plane if you raised enough war bonds to support it. So it was a very patriotic community. And then what occurred was that there began to be a lot of communities that had previously either not been built or not been open to Jews that did open up. The San Fernando Valley became a new location that Jews moved into. And in fact, 1/3 of the development in the San Fernando Valley came from Jewish developers. And then you had Hancock Park, the Fairfax district that came open. Those Jews that were in the Army and the Navy and the armed forces came back with GI benefits. And they started to say, well, I want to start a family now that I've returned. Where should I live? What had happened during the right before the war was that there was a movement, not so much the racially restrictive covenants, but now the federal government was trying to support home mortgages, which of course the whole housing market had been disrupted by the Depression. And they began to engage in redlining, i.e. they would identify communities that they saw as risks, and that often was translated into making Boyle Heights a riskier place to get a mortgage than somewhere else. That literally the government report on Boyle Heights said it was hopelessly heterogeneous with diverse and subversive racial elements throughout, and it designated it as red. Whereas San Fernando Valley or other places were green. That's the places that we're gonna put the best rates. So with a young family looking to put their investment somewhere, it was a much better deal to go to the same house in the San Fernando Valley, a new house, than to try to stay in Boyle Heights, even though many people wanted to stay. And so what you had was a whole population movement out. The one group that tended to stay in Boyle Heights were those that were committed radicals. And so you had union people, but you also had communists and socialists that they were always in Boyle Heights, but they were the ones that stayed the longest, really until the 50s and 60s.
And other groups came in, larger groups. I imagine, I think it's during World War II, more African Americans moved in to the houses that the Japanese Americans vacated. They subdivided the houses even further, making them smaller, making Boyle Heights even denser, correct?
Right. After you had a couple of different things happening during the war, you had that. You had also, the war industries needed workers. So you had African Americans coming in from the South. You eventually would have more Mexican immigrants coming, particularly former braceros, who would. And during the war itself, public housing units began to be built all over Boyle Heights. That's where 5 or 6 of them built in Boyle Heights. And so after the war, as Los Angeles kind of pulled away from public housing structurally, those became almost exclusively either African American or Latino. And in Boyle Heights, often both those populations in the 40s and 50s moved into the public housing units in Boyle Heights, Ramona Gardens, Aliso Village, all of those very large public housing units.
And this worry caused some of the leaders to do something even more sinister in terms of the sterilization program.
Right. Eventually, attracting Mexican immigrants, and then what would happen in 1965 with the change in the immigration legislation, what had previously been legal immigration became now on a quota system. Mexico for the first time was put under a quota system of only 20,000 yearly legal immigrants, but all those patterns had been set up of migration from Mexico. So now you had a growth of undocumented immigration coming. in the 60s and 70s. Meantime, a big effort to control the populations. And those Mexican immigrants often became targeted for various kinds of birth control efforts, but particularly sterilization. And there's one very famous case in the 1970s of Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants being targeted by USC County General Hospital for that effort as they were trying to increase their birth, their sterilization activities in the neighborhood.
Wow. But these kind of actions against people also gave rise to activists. Like I talked to you about Paula Crisostomo and Vicky Castro, and there was kind of a citizens movement toward people, Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, establishing their rights.
Exactly. Here are two high school students from the 1960s that really saw that they weren't getting the same education that other students in Los Angeles were getting from other schools. And over the course of the 60s, they began to understand this, and then they began to, with other high school students, talk about what they could do. And under the guidance of Sal Castro, who's from Lincoln High School, they began to create a movement to really protest this activity. In 1968, they'll lead in March major walkout, the first major walkout of students from LA high schools, particularly on the east side of Los Angeles. So the five big high schools, including Roosevelt, but also Lincoln, Garfield, Wilson, they will walk out and really create a huge dynamic, a huge turn that forces city officials to really look at what's happening in the schools. They want bilingual ed, they want more Mexican American teachers, they want even Mexican food in the dining rooms. None of that was available to them. And they want college prep courses, which often they were kept out of. So they're the ones that sort of lead to a lot of the educational changes that we see in East LA.
Wow. We just have a few minutes left, and I'm encouraging anybody to please type in questions. I would be remiss to not mention a great man, the first Mexican American city councilman, Edward Roybal, who's very prominent in your book.
Absolutely.
If you could just touch on.
Yeah, he's picked in the 1940s after the war as someone who has the greatest chance of being elected, but it isn't. He runs in 47 and does not win, only gets 15% of the vote. And between 1947 and 49, he helps found an organization called the Community Services Organization that begins to emphatically try to register Mexican American voters in Boyle Heights, so that group would then come to the polls in 1949, and they do in large numbers. Now that effort is supported not only by on-the-ground Mexican American activists, often coming out of the labor unions, coming out of various World War II efforts, but also by the Jewish community that feels like we need to encourage the empowerment. Saul Alinsky, who's known as a major activist in Chicago, he spent his summers in Boyle Heights in the Jewish community, so he has a particular connection to Boyle Heights. And he's getting Jews from the West Side to fund, through him, efforts that allow him to fund Fred Ross as the major organizer of the Community Services Organization. Mm-hmm. All that comes together in 1949, electing Edward Roybal to the city council, the first Mexican American in the 20th century elected. He will stay in that place till 1962. For most of that era, the city council is a fairly right-wing organization, very anti-communist, but he will be the champion of liberal causes in the city council. He will fight some of the displacement from freeways. He will, he'll be a big advocate for fair employment and fair housing legislation. He's still, I think, a great symbol. In 62, he'll then move on to become the US congressman from the area. But I find, I still take a lot of incredible. He's one of my heroes, basically. And now, of course, he's produced who's the current U.S. Congresswoman. His daughter, Lucille Roybal-Allard, is still in Congress from the area.
Is there a school or anything named after Edward Roybal?
There's all kinds of things now. Roybal has a very distinguished career, so there's a school named after him. There, you know, one of the things that's named after him, for example, is the buildings down at the CDC in Atlanta, because he's a huge opponent in Congress of issues of gerontology for the aged. Yeah, he's having more and more things named after him all over the country, really, but including in Los Angeles.
That's great. There are so many interesting people you wrote about, George, but I really want to ask you about Leo Frumkin.
Yes.
He was like my favorite person in this book.
Leo is a great person and was a great interview. Both his parents come, one from the Ukraine, one from Russia. They meet in the Mojave Desert at a place for people suffering from tuberculosis, but the father decides he wants to build his home in Boyle Heights. So in 1916, they moved there, and Frumkin is born right after World War I to this family. And Frumkin talks very openly about that his family came with all kinds of political traditions. Communist, socialist, social democratic, Zionist, anti-Zionist, Yiddish, everything under the sun. So you get a sense of a family that is where political discussion is happening all the time. And Leo Frumkin talks about the neighborhood having as much influence on him as these family backgrounds. He said, you know, we all stayed together on his block. The parents would offer him tortillas, and his mother would offer them matzah back. And the exchange made him made him an internationalist. He believed that, you know, all the people of the world should gather together and sort of connect with each other. And so his history is so fascinating in both the Jewish traditions he brought, but also the ways in which he ended up fighting for so many different issues. He became a big labor organizer as a young person. He fought like at Hollenbeck Junior High. He was going to be student body president at the end of the war, and he got in trouble for talking about the Japanese internment camps as concentration camps. The principal pulled him aside and said, you know, that you shouldn't call them that. He said, what do you mean? You know, what did they have to do with the war? Why were they, you know? So he was willing to argue. And Frumkin just had this wonderful way about him connecting with all different kinds of groups, leading protests, being very active, and providing a window into this exchange that happened, as well as a window into the changing Jewish community. I love a part of it where he quotes, he says, as he was a teenager, he said he smoked, and he would never dump his ashtrays in Boyle Heights. He said he would dump them when he got to the west side, because he knew they'd clean it up there. He wasn't sure about the services but he never did that. And they kept the doors open, and you know, it was just wonderful observations on life in Boyle Heights.
Oh, that's great. We have a couple questions, but I wanted to close my part with a passage that I really love, that you wrote, that I really love, that perfectly summed up Boyle Heights. And you wrote, "This growing together is often mistaken for assimilation, but the difference is obvious in that it is not directed toward incorporation into the dominant culture. For that reason, the pluralism that results does not involve the dissolution of national backgrounds and cultural history, but their continued affirmation and enforcement, even as they are transformed." That's some wonderful writing, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have some questions here. Ruby wanted to know, is gentrification impacting Boyle Heights? If so, how?
Well, Ruby, I think the answer is yes, it's impacting. In fact, the last chapter of my book, the 10th chapter, that's its principal purpose, is to talk about gentrification. There's gentrification, I think, in Boyle Heights can be broken down in a couple of different ways. The first, there's a huge effort to, and there has been a huge effort the last 10 years or so to not have what was happened in a lot of other LA downtown neighborhoods happen in Boyle Heights. This complete transformation of the population, particularly in terms of its businesses and its public face. So for example, the story I tell is the one that probably is most famous in Boyle Heights, which is art galleries moving in to the flats area from all over the city. Because of course, the arts district right on the other side of the river is one of the huge areas of gentrification for the city, and rents are going up, everything's going up. So those art galleries tried to move across the river to the flats area, an old industrial area for Boyle Heights. People fought it, and there's a number of organizations that fought it very directly, and for the most part, they won. That battle. Those art galleries have left after 2 or 3 or 4 years in Boyle Heights. So it's an interesting place where people they had to deal with a very organized community, and that organization is part of that longer history. So that's one part of the story. But the real thing affecting Boyle Heights and the real issues in gentrification are not the public facing of coffee houses and art galleries, but I think the real issue is rents. I am particularly worried that the rents are going up, and that may price out low-income people. They may price out recent immigrants because they just can't afford to live there. Like one of the groups I worry a lot about is mariachis, right? You have Mariachi Plaza in Boyle Heights, named after this group, and mariachis live all around the plaza, and many places are named after them. But they are finding it harder and harder to live because their rents keep going up. So that involves issues of citywide housing policies, not having enough density in a lot of places that want to stay single family homes, when in fact, as you build the metro system, you have to have density and more housing available. But it involves something else, which I think has been identified. One of the things you don't yet see in Boyle Heights, everybody's looking for it all the time, is Boyle Heights is still, at the last count, 96% Latino. So you haven't had the racial transformation that you've had in places like Echo Park, for example, to use another community. But you are seeing that people who go to college, out of the Latino community, including people from Boyle Heights that go to college, are now returning to Boyle Heights. They sometimes are buying property, homes to live in. They're sometimes driving up the rents. So you have something that people have called gentrification. Rather than gentrification, you've got Latinos that have a little more income raising rents and things. And that's a real issue in Boyle Heights, because you want to make sure that low-income people and recent immigrants can still add to the cultural mix in Boyle Heights. And if you price them out of the market, that's not going to happen. So there's a lot of big developments right now in Boyle Heights that I'm looking at. The Sears Tower is one, Riverwood Apartments is another, all on the south side. If those change, that's going to have a profound transformation in Boyle Heights and gentrification. So that's a big thing that's part of the community, but it's a big thing to discuss in some different ways than it has been in Echo Park and other places.
Interesting. So how do you see the future going?
I think that there has to be a couple of serious discussions, like on gentrification, to really think through how is this community going to function. But the biggest thing that I see, that I think everyone else can learn from Boyle Heights, I really think that right now we're under a crisis of democracy. There's a whole question of whether these multiracial communities, how will we live together, right? And you see this as a national issue, but I think you got to go to the neighborhood. And I think Boyle Heights actually is a great model for what we have to do in the future. both in terms of its history of the multiracial learning together, living together, but also in terms of how do we incorporate undocumented immigrants into community life, into political organizations like Mothers of East LA. You know, they have been incorporated in non-electoral ways into local democracy. And I'm very hopeful that people can learn from Boyle Heights in other neighborhoods and really talk about democracy. So far, the conversation in gentrification has been much more productive in Boyle Heights than it has been in other neighborhoods. In other neighborhoods, people said, oh, nothing you can do about it, it's just the market. Well, we've had a different discussion in Boyle Heights. I think the city as a whole can learn from that and can really try to adopt some more innovative housing policies and approaches that keep the city available for everyone. And so I feel positive that Boyle Heights provides a good model. And again, if we can continue learning from that model of the historical past and the present, we're going to be able to do much better in Los Angeles in creating communities that remain open to everyone.
Joaquin, thank you for asking that question. For the next question, I'm going to bring on Maurice, former resident of Boyle Heights. I'm going to make you a panelist, Maurice. So get your hair straightened out there. He's a customer of ours. He's one of our favorite customers. So Maurice, are you there? Turn on your camera and your microphone.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello there.
So what are you asking George?
Well, I'm asking a general question, and you've almost answered it, George. And that is, my experience, I was not a former resident, but when I was 5 and 7 years old, I hung out in Brooklyn and Soto. We went to Curry's ice cream shop and even the Reed Street Shul for a while. So, and I kind of walked the neighborhood, and it was kind of easy going. And I know in the Gilded Past, you know, there were still some tensions between ethnic groups, some gangs here and there, but everything seemed to be a lot more easy.
Yeah.
And today, not just in Boyle Heights, but almost every place else, everything is so brittle. Everything is politically correct. I mean, I could go up to a Mexican American and call him a name that I wouldn't say here. And it would be a name of almost pleasure. And he would accept it as love. And then he would call me a name right back, of course. It was that easygoing kind of stuff. In your experience, both as a dean and this wonderful book you've written, when you step back, what's happening with this more brittle or politically correct or whatever you want to call it? It seems to be everyone's pretty touchy these days about identity or sub-identity. And what made Boyle Heights interesting is that there were tensions, but at the same time, like you said, people grew up with each other, different ethnic.
Yeah.
What would you say?
You know, I would say that there is less of that in Boyle Heights today than there is in other communities. And there's a number of reasons for it. You've pointed to some of them. One is that it's a walking community. There are people who see each other still on Avenida Cesar Chavez, formerly Brooklyn. I was there yesterday having some tacos, people walking by, okay, all kinds of, you know, what you see in Los Angeles, there's some homeless folks, there's people with children, there's kids going with the school. I see the same sort of walking community. It's now overwhelmingly Latino, but it's the same, there's similar kinds of issues. But the fact that it's a walking community with a lot of small shops, people trying to build a life at the ground level, not a lot of big markets, not a lot of big brand names, but all these little shops of people trying to sell this or that. And of course, then the street vendors, the mariachis, that gives me a certain kind of hope of people learning to interact in a very different way, not driving their cars over with just freeways over, but actually having real interactions. So when I spend a significant amount of time in Boyle Heights, I'm thinking about that a lot. I'm thinking about how people exchange with each other on the major streets in Boyle Heights in a way that is rare in other parts of Los Angeles. You know, you're driving by, you may stop at a mini market, and that's about it. And then you're back in your car and you're heading home. You know, Boyle Heights has a very different feel because people are walking, people are interacting. There's a growth of an art scene, and I think that that's what makes it appealing. That still, that, you know, that for me resonates back to when many of those shops were Jewish owned. That was Phillips Music Store. That was Cantor's. That was, you know, it's the same feel. It's just a different ethnicity now in those neighborhoods. I think the biggest issues that Boyle Heights confronts is, you know, it has a lot of places where you know, 75% of the people are renting, and a lot of absentee landlords. And so a lot of the businesses worry that those places, sometimes people aren't taking care of the homes, and they're just trying to pull as much rent out as possible. And I hear from the people who've been in Boyle Heights for a long time, those are the situations where we have to change. We need more people who live here and are committed to the neighborhood and want to build up the housing again. And where all kinds of people can feel comfortable, you know, sort of coming through. So I have some hope in that way. I guess I'm not as worried about political correctness as such. In many ways, the tensions now are different. They're often within the Latino community, but they're different in that sense. You know, there's how do you reconcile like the old mariachi culture, the immigrants, without the newer you know, youth who are LGBTQ conscious. They have different kinds of bars. They have different sorts of shops. All that seems to be coming together in interesting ways in Boyle Heights that I don't see in a lot of other places, that have to be one thing or another. In Boyle Heights, they seem to all be mixing. And I think that for me is the key. You've got to make sure that all kinds of people have the possibility of having shops next to each other, that you can have a place that's, you know, for old timers and people, you know, and then people for the youngest, you know, hippest crowd. If you have that, if you can maintain that mix, you're going to do a lot better, I think, in Boyle Heights. I'd hate to see it go all one way or all another.
Yeah. Well, I think the walking is really important because I think Los Angeles is a circulatory system, and the heartbeat are the freeways and the cars.
That's
and
right.
It's all privatized. But Boyle Heights is different. It's not privatized yet. So
that's right.
Yeah, thank you so much for your book and your comments and the heart that you put into this. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Maurice, did you bring your family with you?
Well, they should be on, but I'm not sure. I don't know who's on and who's not. But we're trying to do a reunion.
All right. Well, that concludes tonight. George Sanchez, thank you very much. This talk was amazing. I am very grateful that you came on to talk to us.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
And everyone, thank you for joining us. And Maurice, we'll get to work on your family reunion, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.